İyi akşamlar sevgili izleyiciler. İMBAT Akademi'nin 35. bilimsel etkinliğine hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Keyifli bir etkinlik olmasını diliyoruz. Mohammad Khari ve Curtis Kelly'ye davetimizi kabul ettikleri için çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Thank you for accepting our invitation to present tonight. First of all, I would like to thank you. Programımıza kendilerini kısaca tanıtarak başlamak istiyorum. Mohammad Khari is an English lecturer at Özyeğin University, Istanbul. He holds a BA in English Literature and an MA in Philosophy of Art and the SALTA. Mohammad has been reading and researching on the integration of neuroscience into pedagogy, sharing his ideas through a series of professional development sessions. And Curtis Kelly, who is going to be presenting tonight, is a professor at Kansai University, a founder of the JALT Mind, Brain and Education Special Interest Group, and producer of the Mind, Brain and Think Tanks. He has written over 30 books and given over 500 presentations. And his life mission is to relieve the suffering of the classroom. Ve şimdi sözü kendilerine bırakıyorum. Keyifli seyirler diliyorum. Mohammad, Curtis, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. So, let's start the session with this fundamental question, which we are trying to answer in this presentation. And it's a kind of question that we struggle with. So, Curtis, what do you think about how do stories affect learning?
Yeah, I think, teachers use stories all the time in their classes, and we never think about those as being some kind of special tool, but that's what we're going to talk about today, aren't we, Mohammed?
Yep.
We're going to talk about some really special things that stories do to the brain.
Yep.
And speaking of learning, I'd like to encourage everybody to use the chat freely, not to send questions to us necessarily, but just to send comments or ideas to each other, like, I do something like that in my class, or things like that. The chat is a great learning tool, so please feel free to use it as much as you can.
And also, if you're interested in neuroscience, or specifically the link between neuroscience and education, you can subscribe to this magazine that we are working on and we're publishing. You can just scan the QR code or wait towards the end of the session. The link will be shared with you, so you can it would be great if you can just subscribe to that magazine. It is free, by the way.
Yeah, it's one that I produce, but Mohammed's our latest, newest editor for this. And basically, we're just trying to connect things in brain science to language teaching, something that hasn't been part of most educational programs so far. So we're trying to cover that gap ourselves. So please subscribe. It's free, by the way. Okay, well, this is a presentation on stories. So let's start out with a cute little story. And this is a particular type of story, something called a digitale. And that's a word that was made by Rex Tanimoto, this guy from Hawaii that taught at Osaka Gakuin University. And he started teaching digitales and taught me about those. And it's a technique that changed my life. It's something he had his students do. Basically, you tell your students to make a story in PowerPoint. Each slide has a picture and one or two simple sentences, and just let them go at it and create. Okay, so I'm going to show you the first one that I ever saw. It's called Love at First Sight. This is Rex showed this one to me. It was made by Yuki Yasuda, Akiko Nishimura, and Akiko Tomori, 3 first-year student women at Osaka Gakuin University. And Mohammed, I don't know if you're an expert on love or anything, but I'm certainly not. And I think we might be able to learn something from these 3 girls. What do you think, Mohammed?
Yep, let's give it a try.
Okay. Here's the story. James hated himself. He was weak, fat, and short. Yeah, that's me. He was also afraid of girls, and he couldn't talk to them without feeling nervous.
So after going to a restaurant, he fell in love at first sight with a waitress whose name was Jenny.
Oh, there's James and Jenny right there. Okay.
He went to Jenny's restaurant every day.
I recognize those steps. Those are the steps at our university. His love for Jenny made him stalk her. James followed Jenny home every day. One day, she saw him stalking her. Jenny thought James was strange, so she started avoiding him. That's the Japanese kind of cold shoulder. Look.
James hated himself for what he had done. He wanted to change his personality and looks. He decided to start exercising a lot. Soon, he had confidence in himself.
One day, Jenny spilled coffee on a customer by mistake. Where did they get this doll that looks like a Yakuza? The customer started bullying her. James was walking past the restaurant and saw Jenny in trouble.
James entered the restaurant and protected Jenny. Jenny started falling in love with James.
See, that's how it works, Mohammed. Okay. Then James asked her, "Do you believe in love at first sight?" "Yes, I do," replied Jenny. And after a few years, Jenny again said, "Yes, I do."
During their wedding ceremony in a church.
And they lived happily ever after. Okay, isn't that cute? Okay, let's give a round of applause for Akiko, and whatever their names were for making that story. Well, that was cute, right? And it was creative, and you could just see the love and attention these three women put into making that story together. And that wasn't the best Digitales I've ever saw. That was the first one I saw. But there's so many others that the students could really express themselves and make wonderful stories like these three and hundreds of others that Rex's students would produce. And I thought this was amazing. It was a way for students to give speeches to each other, but with visual support. So even if their English wasn't that good, the other people watching could still read it or look at the picture and understand it right away. I thought this was going to be the next big thing in Japan, like extensive reading, except this is extensive speaking. I thought it was going to be a really big hit, but it turned out not to be. And I'll tell you why later. But now, first of all, I'd like you to think about the value of storytelling. It's more useful than you think. You know, there's something happening in our English teaching world, and we're experiencing this constant shift to the left. And by shift to the left, I mean this: a shift towards input instead of output. You know what I mean? And it's happening mainly because we're in the age of psychometrics. And all these tests that determine whether you get into a company or what position you get, and other tests are basically input tests. They're measuring listening and reading ability, not output ability. And there's kind of a problem with that, in that it biases English ability towards a certain type of learner, analytical learners, like the engineers, the ones that are very good at memorizing details. But unlike relational learners who aren't very good at details and not good on item tests and are more global, they tend not to do as well. Well, to be fair, TOEIC, IELTS, TOEFL, and these other language tests, almost all of them have a speaking test as well, but nobody uses it. Nobody takes it. All the tests that really make the difference are all input-oriented tests. But storytelling, getting your students to do storytelling, overcomes that. It's a way to bring output back as a main part of the classroom. So it's one of the values right there.
So, Curtis, the question here is, do you think the stories have something innate in them or a sort of potential for learning? That's the question that we're going to talk about.
Absolutely do, yeah. How about you, Mohammed? Do you think so?
I do believe so, yes.
Yeah, I think there's something really special about stories. I use them in my classes, and I notice when I start telling a story, everybody quiets down and tunes in. And so let's look at how that works. But first, let's give Hava a chance to give a summary of what we just talked about.
Thank you, Curtis and Mohammad. Thank you for this great intro. Evet, aslında şu ana kadar hocalarımız dil öğretim süreçlerine tabii İngilizce bağlamında birazcık daha ele alınmış oldu ama aslında dil öğretimi olarak genelleştirebiliriz belki de bunu. Hikayelerin ya da öykülerin nasıl öğrenmeye etkisi olabileceğinden bahsettiler ve aslında bu anlamda çok önemli araçlar olduğundan bahsettiler. Bu arada özellikle sinir bilimle ilgilenenlere yönelik hiçbir üyelik gerektirmeyen ve ücretsiz erişimin mümkün olduğu bir takım dergi önerileri oldu. Bu sunum bitiminde, webinar bitiminde sizinle chatten bu gerekli linkleri paylaşıyor olacağız. Digital diye hocamızın bahsettiği aslında dijital öyküleme, Hawaii'deki bir üniversiteden Rex Bey'in başlatmış olduğu bir uygulama. Dijital öyküleme olarak ben biraz araştırdım. Bizim Türkiye'de de alan yazına geçmiş bir çalışma. Digital Storytelling olarak da geçiyor. Aslında neden bunun çok önemli olduğunu vurguluyor Curtis. Çünkü özellikle son dönemlerde dil öğretimindeki uluslararası bağlamda ele aldığımız sınavlar olan işte TOEFL olsun, IELTS olsun, TOEIC olsun bu gibi sınavlarda aslında vurgunun artık daha ziyade girdiye yönelik olduğu, öğrencilerin pasif dil alıcıları olarak ele alındığı yönünde. Oysa ki bu tür projelerle öğrencilerin bu şekilde yapmış olduğu daha ürün ve üretim bazlı çalışmalarla aslında girdiden ziyade öğrencilerin dili kullandıkları ve dili kullanarak ürettikleri şekilde yapılan çalışmaların ön plana alınmasını öneriyor hocamız. Özellikle input yani girdi bağlamında ele alınan dil öğretim yaklaşımlarında birazcık daha böyle mühendislerin düşünce yapısına yakın, analitiğin daha çok ön plana alındığı. Oysa ki dil öğrenim süreçlerinde bizim ilişkisel boyutta da öğrencilere alan açmamız gerektiğine dair önerileri var. Bu bakış açısıyla o zaman bu bahsettiğimiz hikaye anlatılması, öyküler oluşturulması ya da extensive reading dediğimiz yine bizim alan yazımımızda da oldukça önemli bir yer kapsamakta olan yaygın okuma dediğimiz çalışmalara daha fazla önem verilmesi gerektiğini belirttiler. Ve aslında bir soruyla da bu ilk kısmı noktalamış oldular. Gerçekten hikayelerin öğrenme için bir potansiyel oluşturması durumu var mıdır dediler. Thank you. So this was the quick summary of the first part. Curtis and Mohammad, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll continue here. So the big question is, do stories have some special potential for learning? Well, let's look at some of the research here. For example, let's compare two modes of delivery of information through stories versus explaining. Mohammad, could you tell us about some amazing findings about stories?
Yeah, as you said, according to this, the findings from some research, that we now know that learners learn faster if the information is given to them through stories, and they remember these bits of information for a longer period of time. Their retention quality and the quantity of the retention is actually more in comparison with lectures when the information is given to them through stories.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a very interesting fact that we will come back to later, but that is the factor of being interesting. So we will talk about that later, but these are the things that we know right now.
Oh, right. Thank you. I'll go through the studies really, really quickly. Don't even try to read these small things on the screen, but I'll just give you some of the studies that just show how powerful stories are. Oakes in 1995 found better retention from narrative lectures than traditional lectures. Berwitz and Taylor found that children recalled significantly more information from the narrative passages than expository passages. George and Schauer found that kindergarten children's recall of prose content was found significantly higher when given by storytelling than television. Gresser, Hoffman, and Clark found the narrative texts are read faster and remembered twice as well as expository texts, high correlation between narrativity and the amount of information recalled, yet familiarity and interestingness had a very small effect. Johnson found the students making nano-narratives, just 2 or 3 lines of information, had improved recall after several days. So, Mohammed, do any of these stand out for you as possibly interesting?
Yep, I mean, that's exactly the one that I was talking about. I mean, the one that done by Gracer, Hoffman, and Clark actually is the one that stands out here. And if we take a look at the details of the data that we have here, so we know that according to this research that the narrative texts are read faster and remembered twice as well as the expository text. You mentioned that, but I want you to just pay attention to the last part, that familiarity and interestingness had very small effect, which is a game changer here. So that is something that you have to think about.
Exactly. That's the fascinating thing. We think of stories. Well, stories are interesting, so students learn better. But it's not just that. There's something in the narrative structure itself that fits the human brain. I'll say it again. There's something in stories, the way stories are organized, that fits the human brain and lead to better learning. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Well, here's another one too, by the way. How does this affect language teaching? Well, 2 studies by Bauer, Callahan, Clark, and Higbee were done with word recall. Now, in these studies, students were given lists of words to memorize. I think these might have been native speakers, by the way. I'm not sure they were non-native speakers. But they're given lists of words to memorize. Half the students were told to memorize these words any way they wanted, by writing them down, repeating, or whatever. The other half were told to make stories out of the words, even silly stories, like the example here. Well, which group, let's ask Kava here, which group do you think did better in terms of word recall? The group that memorized the words any way they wanted to, or the group that made stories?
I guess the group that created their own context, stories.
Yes, exactly. Otherwise, I wouldn't have this in my presentation, would I? But how much better do you think it was? Take a guess, Hava, or anybody in chat. You think maybe 20% more word recall? 30%?
100? Would it be too much?
How much?
100%.
100%, just about. 6 to 7 times higher, or 2 to 7 times higher word recall if they were studied through stories. Now, even at the lowest value, twice as many words are remembered. Imagine if you could get your students to remember twice as much of the vocabulary you teach if they put it into stories than your usual method. I mean, that's amazing.
And there was a guess, one of the people listening, they said 70%, but it was far more than that, right?
Yeah. Okay. So, Mohammed, would you give us that summary again here?
Yep. So far, we just established some facts that narrative texts are read about twice as fast as expository text. Expository texts are the texts that explain stuff and are remembered for up to twice as long. So that is one of the things that we know. The other one is that retention is higher, when it means they remember it better for a longer period of time. And the factors, let's say the agreed upon factors of being interesting, they don't actually play that important role in this.
Exactly. There's something in the narrative structure itself. And so that's the big question of the day. We're going to ask everybody. We're going to try to have you figure this out. And if you have an idea, type it in the chat. But why are stories so brain compatible? Why are stories so brain compatible? If you get any theories on that, please feel free to share it with us. What do they reveal about the brain itself, the way that we learn from stories? And Hava, your turn.
Thank you, Curtis. Yani evet, bu ikinci bölümde aslında bahsedilen daha çok anlatısal metinlerle bilgilendirici metinlerin karşılaştırılması gibi ele alınabilir. Bu bağlamda Muhammed'in de sunduğu üzere hikayelerle ilgili önemli bir takım bilgiler var elimizde. Yapılan çalışmalardan yola çıkılarak biz artık şunu söyleyebiliyoruz. Bu tür hikaye çalışmaları yapıldığında öğrenciler çok daha hızlı öğreniyorlar, çok daha fazla hatırlıyorlar. Özellikle geleneksel anlamdaki derslerden sadece öğretmenin öğrenciye aktarıcı konumunda olduğu çok daha fazla bir öğrenme gerçekleşiyor diyebiliriz. Ve burada bakın ilginç olmasından bu metinlerin hiç bahsedilmiyor bile. Yine Muhammed'in ifade ettiği gibi özellikle öğrencilerin bu konuyu önceden biliyor olmaları, bu konuya aşina olmaları ya da konunun ilginçliği çok bir etkiye sahip değil yapılan çalışmalarda. Bunların etkisi çok çok az. Ama işte Harvard'da yapılan bir takım çalışmalar vardı, yanlış görmediysem. Ve farklı yaş gruplarında, en önemlisi de bu, çok daha iyi bir öğrenmenin gerçekleştiği ve öğrencilerin çok fazla, 6-7 kat gibiydi zannediyorum değil mi? 2 ila 7 ve 6 ila 7 kat gibi bir oranda daha fazla hatırlıyor oldukları bu çalışılan sözcükleri. Ve aslında oradaki verilen örnekte şuydu, solda bir kelime listesi verilmişti. Katılımcıların yarısına denmişti ki bu sözcükleri istediğiniz gibi öğrenin, ezberleyebilirsiniz. Kendi özgün yöntemlerinizi kullanabilirsiniz. Fakat bir diğer yarısına ise bir öykü oluşturmaları söylendi. Bu grubun tabii ki hatırlama oranlarının çok daha yüksek olduğunu söylüyoruz. Özellikle yine anlatısal metinler ve okuma hızının artması arasındaki ilişkiye bakıldığında 0,92 gibi bir olumlu ilişki olduğu tespit edilmiş durumda. Özetle sadece konunun anlaşılması, sonradan hatırlanması değil aslında sözcük öğretimi bağlamında da ele alındığında öykülerin çok daha etkin olduğunu söyleyebiliyoruz. Ve aslında buradaki kritik soru da Curtis'in ifade ettiği gibi hikayeler ya da bu anlatısal metinler neden bu kadar beynimize uyumlu? Belki de günün cevaplanması gereken sorusu bu. Thank you, Curtis. Over to you.
Okay. So again, the big question of the day for the audience to try to figure out is, why are stories so brain compatible? I already see that Sarah has something in there. They have to do with connections, memories. Yeah, you're on the right path there. Okay. But please type in any theories that you have as we go along. Well, advertisers know that stories really, we learn from stories more than other sources. So they're using stories all the time. Those television commercials we usually see are stories. And let me show you one little advertisement that is really amazing. Do you know what this is? Do you recognize what this is? Might be a couple years old, but you've seen this on your computer. Mohammed, do you know what this is?
I mean, it looks like a search bar, I guess.
Exactly. It's the Google search bar. I mean, Google, we use Google all the time, right? And we use Google search. And Google decided never to do advertisements of their search bar or their products. But a couple of their technicians made this really interesting video, this touching video about the search bar. And they liked it so much that they turned it into a television commercial at the American Super Bowl in 2015 or something like that. And what the most expensive advertising in the world, and they showed this there. Well, how would you advertise a search bar? As a spelling checker, it lets you see maps, and well, watch how they did it, because they use stories. Now watch very carefully what gets typed into the search bar. Wow, that's so nice. It's very fast, so I'll show it again, but let me just summarize what happened. It's about an American student that goes study abroad to Paris, and he meets a French woman. They fall in love. He has to go back to America, but he uses Google Google to find a job in Paris. He flies back to Paris, and we see him searching for a church because they're getting married. And the very final screen is how to assemble a crib, how to make a baby bed. So we know that they had children together. Not exactly what you'd expect to be for advertising a search bar. And that's why Google liked it so much. So let me show it to you one more time. Oh, so the people that are helping us in the chat, how do you feel about this video? How does that make you feel? Hava, how about you? How do you feel after seeing
Very
this little
cute indeed. It's very romantic and very cute indeed.
Are
Very
you touched?
creative.
Do you have a wet spot on your eyes like I almost do? Even though I've seen this so many times, it's touching, yeah. And that's why I played it twice, because I knew the first time through you'd be using all your brain's resources for the linguistic processing. The second time I played it through, you'd probably have all that worked out already, so you could focus more on the message. And I think most people who see this feel something. I've seen people raise tissues to their eyes when they do this in a live audience. But if Google can make such a powerful message through a story to teach us about a search bar, this technical, mechanical computer program thing, the question is, why can't we? Why are our English classes so boring most of the time? Why are so many of the textbooks like, memorize this list of vocabulary and finish this exercise? Why don't we use materials like this in education, stories? Well, the truth is we do. How did Newton discover gravity? Who's the boy that failed math 6 times in elementary school, which is not quite true, actually. That was Einstein. How was Caesar killed? How much did the Dutch buy Manhattan Island from the Indians for? How was gravity discovered? The law of inertia. I can't remember what it is, but Galileo and dropping the balls, and they both arrive at the same time. We use a lot of stories in basic education, and we do it in language teaching too in certain areas. The power of stories in graded readers.
So,
Mohammed, do you use?
Yeah. I was just going to ask the same question. I mean, because as a teacher because I remember when I was learning English, I used a lot of these books. So the question here is, what about graded readers or extensive reading? Don't they use stories in some forms?
Yeah. I think if you look at these titles here, they're all stories of one type or another. The ones that are movies or whatnot. So that's probably why graded readers are so effective, because they're using stories, and we know that we learn so well from such stories. In fact, let me show you a little bit of research here, Mohammed.
Yeah.
This is a Japanese high school called Kosen, and it's a 4-year program where they did extensive reading over 4 years. And there's 4 groups in the school: Group A, Group B, Group C, Group D. Group A, during the 4 years, only read a few thousand words. I can't remember how many, and you can see the yellow bars. That's their TOEIC score at graduation. Kind of low. They only read an average of 400, and their average was 435 on the TOEIC test. Group B read 766,000 words. That's the equivalent of 5 Harry Potter novels over 4 years, of course. And of course, at a lower level. And look at how much better their TOEIC scores are. In fact, their TOEIC score is the same as a Japanese university 4th-year student. Group C really went to town. They read 1.8 million words. And if you look at their TOEIC score, it's almost the same as Group D. Group D did not do extensive reading. Group D studied abroad for a year. Oops, sorry. My arrows. Oops, sorry about that. Group D went abroad for a year. The average of Group C and Group D was almost exactly the same. So extensive reading, if done to that level, is the equivalent of going abroad for a year. That's amazing. So why does extensive reading work, Mohammad?
I mean, this is so far what we know. Again, this is the experts say these 3 things.
Uh-huh.
The first one is graded reading or extensive reading provide exposure to the language. And I think it's a known fact that when they read more, they are exposed to the language more.
Yeah.
The second one is coming from this Krashen's idea that it provides comprehensible input. It means the learners or the students can understand something as a whole, even though they don't understand the components of that thing. So that is one of the functions of extensive reading, actually. And the other one is it builds automaticity. And it, again, just to explain automaticity, is just this mechanism that happens that you understand something automatically without thinking about it. So in this case, the students can learn chunks of, for example, words together automatically, which is going to be kept in their memory for a longer period of time. So these are the things that we know about extensive reading.
Yeah, I've seen the pundits say exactly those 3 things again and again, but it hit me. That's true for most textbooks that we use. Lots of exposure to the language, comprehensible input, and it builds automaticity. So why is extensive reading so much more powerful than just a regular language textbook? Like this is a common textbook used in Japanese high schools. It doesn't quite doesn't quite tell us why. It's not just that. And of course, it hit me first that because extensive reading books is pleasurable. And there's something about the brain where the brain is built to remember what makes it feel good. And this causes dopamine release. Now, dopamine, that's Eric Kandel, by the way, that found that dopamine release is related to deeper learning. But dopamine is a neurotransmitter that controls all motivation. If you didn't have dopamine in your system, you'd starve to death because you'd have no desire to eat. All reward, that was good. And when dopamine is released, it causes stronger synapses to form. In other words, deeper learning. So something pleasurable leads to better learning. And we don't think of pleasure that much as a brain function because we think of the brain as being like a computer. But actually, we should think of the brain as being more like a pharmacy. The brain produces over 1,000 different hormones and neurotransmitters that affect your mood and your behavior all the time. So think of the brain as like a pharmacy. So why are stories so brain compatible? Oops, I went too far there. So it occurred to me that graded extensive reading causes pleasure, and so it's going to be learned more quickly that way. And that's one of the reasons why stories are so brain compatible. Because that's yours.
So far, Curtis, we talked about one of the reasons or one of the factors answering this fundamental question here in this presentation, that why a story is so brain compatible or why our brains love a story. So you mentioned some ideas about being pleasurable and the release of dopamine in the brain. But what are other factors? I mean, what can be added to this list of the reasons?
Well, we'll get to that in a second, but exactly what you said. Our brains rely on emotion, and emotion is far more important in learning than we as teachers usually realize. In fact, Helen Imardino Yang wrote a book on emotions, learning, and the brain. But we both did plenaries together once in Italy. And she says basically that emotions are the things that steer us through life. Emotions are the thing that keep you away from the cliff edge. Emotions are things that make you go into that store that says 50% off today only. That it drives us through life. And if we don't have emotions, we don't have no decision-making ability. So emotions are the brain's way to separate what's important for us to not. And basically, she works with Damasio, the emotion expert, neuroscientist. No emotion, no learning. You cannot learn something that's not meaningful to you. In fact, I'll let everybody read her quote on that. So basically, we learn the things we care about. And it's important for teachers teaching a language, not just to dish out language for students to memorize, to learn, but to make them care about it. And we do that with a 5-word sentence that we use all the time, which is, "This will be on the test." But if we could do it other ways, like such as the Google, the Google advertisement, that'd be a lot better than just saying, you're going to need to learn this for the test. So why does ER work? Pleasurable is one reason, but there's another reason too. It uses that narrative structure that we saw so mysteriously is related to retention, better retention. Okay, Hava.
All right, I'll try my best to very quickly summarize all these things which are very important, Curtis. Şöyle hızlıca toparlamamız gerekirse aslında reklamlardan yola çıkarak bu anlatısal metin yapılarının reklamlarda dahi nasıl kullanıldığına dair bir takım örnekler paylaştı bizimle Curtis. Google arama çubuğunun özellikle reklamı için hazırlanmış olan o çok etkileyici hikayeden bahsetti. Sonrasında geldiğimiz noktada seviyelendirilmiş kitapların kullanılması aslında. Yani ta 1921'e Thorndike'a dayanan bir süreç, bu yaygın okuma dediğimiz süreçler. Bunların etkilerinden bahsetti ve yine Japonya'daki bir okulda yapılan çalışmalardan bahsetti. Neredeyse yurt dışında bir yılını geçirmiş olan bir öğrenci grubuna yakın TOEIC skorları elde etmiş öğrencilerden bahsetti. Yapılmış olan bu yaygın okuma çalışmaları sonrasında. Peki neden etkili bu yaygın okuma çalışmaları sorusunu cevapladığımızda ise aslında tüm diğer dil öğretiminde kullanılan ders kitaplarında olduğu gibi evet öğrencileri dile maruz bırakıyor. Evet işte Stephen Krashen'dan bildiğimiz anlaşılabilir girdi sağlıyor. Comprehensible input dediğimiz. Çünkü belirli bir seviyeye göre dizayn edilmiş, hazırlanmış kitaplar. Automaticity dediğimiz aslında öğrencinin otomatiklik kazanması, belki de o eş dizimsel yapıları daha iyi hatırlamaları, onları daha iyi öğrenmeleri ve sonucunda da daha akıcı bir şekilde dili kullanabilir hale gelmelerini sağlıyor. Fakat bu tür kitapların aslında farklı olduğu bir nokta, bunların aslında çok zevkli bir süreç sağlıyor olması, öğrencilerin okudukça bu kitaplardan da zevk alıyor olması. Bu bağlamda dopaminden bahsetti ve aslında beynin daha çok bilgisayardan çok bir eczaneye benzetilebileceğini, çünkü içeride sürekli farklı hormon salgılanma süreçlerinin olduğunu, bu sinir ileticilerin, sinir taşıyıcıların nasıl çalıştığına dair örnekleri oldu. Dopaminden bahsettiğimizde aslında bizi güdüleyen hormon, özellikle ödül bağlamında ve en önemlisi de daha derin bir şekilde öğrenmemizi ve kalıcı öğrenmemizi sağlıyor dopamin. Daha çok ve daha güçlü sinapsler oluşmasını sağlıyor beynimizde ve bu da aslında bizim keyif aldığımız süreçlerden sonra ortaya çıkan bir hormon diyebiliriz belki. Yine buradan yola çıkarak aslında neden hikayelerin yine beynimizle bu kadar uyumlu olduğundan bahsedecek olursak, duygudan bahsediyoruz burada. Aslında beynimizin de ne kadar duyguya dayalı olarak çalıştığı, hayatımızı aslında bu anlamda duyguların yönlendirdiği ve aslında beynin duygular aracılığıyla bizim için neyin önemli olup neyin önemli olmadığına karar veriyor olması gibi bir takım paylaşımları oldu. Şöyle çok güzel bir bilgi de geçti aslında. Duygu olmadığında öğrenmenin gerçekleşmediği. Belki de biz dil derslerimizi yapılandırırken bu noktayı gözden kaçırabiliyoruz zaman zaman. Ve yine Immordino Young'ın 2016 kitabından bir paylaşımı oldu. Aslında özetlemek gerekirse yine sinir bilimsel olarak ve biyolojik boyutta beyni ele aldığımızda bu bizim karar verme süreçlerimizi de çok etkiliyor aslında. Biz sadece önemsediğimiz, duygusal olarak bizi etkileyen şeyleri düşünüyoruz ve bunları daha uzun sürelerde hatırlıyoruz. Tekrar özetlememiz gerekirse yaygın okuma dediğimiz çalışmalar aslında bize çok daha fazla bir keyif sağlıyor ve de anlatısal bir boyutta var. Bu tür kitapların kullanımını içeren süreçlerde diyebiliriz. Thank you, Curtis. A very quick summary.
Okay, thank you too. So Mohammed, we still haven't really answered the big question. So,
I mean, so far we established this fact that reading the stories, or in general the stories, are working in some way because it is pleasurable. But you mentioned something before this summary was given, and you mentioned something about the structure of the narrative in the story. Can you explain that a bit more?
yeah, okay, well, yeah, and also the impact that somebody in the I think Koso wrote in there too. I suppose the reasons they replicate life events. That's another factor here. We'll get to the how the narrative structure impacts us, but I'd like to show you another digitale. Is that okay? This was made by a first-year high school student in Japan, Tomiyama Aika. Okay, first-year high school. That's a student. That's important. It's called Colorful Bears.
There was one small house in the forest. Mother bear and 5 child bears lived there.
All the 5 bears were different color: red bear cherry, pink bear peach, blue bear berry, yellow bear lemon, and green bear lime. The children thought, we all have the same face. What if we all become the same color? Mom won't know who we are.
Children made their bodies pure white with paint. They were going to show it to Mother. Mom won't know who we are.
Mom, do you know who I am? One child bear said. Oh, Mother was very surprised. However, Mother said with a smile, of course, you're Yellow Bear Lemon. And Mother said everyone's name one after another. Well, how do you know even though everyone's the same color? The children said. Mother said, easy, because you differ one by one. Your expression and character are different, even though your faces, in this case bodies, look alike. You're not the same at all. The children smiled too. Indeed, we all differ one by one. Mother and 5 child bears were happy. End. A story made up by a first-year Japanese high school student. Oh, it's so touching. They're so cute. But I was giving this presentation in Sendai, Japan. I was showing the story, and suddenly something dawned on me. Something hit me about this story in relation to a first-year high school. Why would she make this particular story? And we're asking today, what is it about stories? But what is it about this story that hit me? And I give you a hint. There's something about the content of the story that fits what a Japanese first-year high school student goes through. Can you figure out why this story was so meaningful for her? Well, Mohammed, what do you know about Japanese high schools?
I mean, from what I've heard, uh, there is some changes that happens when students enter the high school in Japan. One of them is the schools are very strict about the uniforms, as you can see in the, and it is not
Exactly.
only it is not only about their appearance. They are actually advocating this idea of uniformity in appearance and other things like behavior. So they need to follow some strict, I guess, sets of behavior, as far as I know. Is that the case, or is that
You
one of
got
the...
it exact. You're exactly right there, Mohammed. Most people don't know it. The stereotype of Japanese education is very rigid and martial, but that doesn't happen until junior high school and high school. In Japanese elementary schools, the kids are freer than even American schools. You know, they run around, they're doing kind of different things, but suddenly all the clamps and rules come down when they get into junior high school and high school. They're told how to bow, what kind of clothes they can wear. They're not allowed to color their hair, what kind of hairstyles they're allowed to use, what kind of books they're allowed to use, where they're allowed to go in town. Suddenly, all these rules come down just at a time in their life, teens, when the need for autonomy is shooting way up. And school does not match that. So, how would that be related to this story? Colorful bears. Remember, all the bears painted themselves white, but the mother said, "Don't worry, you still are the same. You're still different one by one." What do you think, Mohammed or Hava?
I mean, it has some touches on the idea of uniformity. As you said, they are all the same color in the story. So that's what I get
Yeah,
from this part. Yeah.
exactly. The idea that, okay, we all have to do this stuff on the outside, wear these uniforms and be this. We have to give up our individuality on the outside, but it's okay because we're still ourselves inside. So this story was kind of a helping her solve that trauma that all Japanese youth go through at that time. The story was a psychological tool for her to solve a personal psychological problem. That problem. And that brings us to this great thing that E.O. Wilson, the great scientist teacher, said. Mohammed, could you tell us about that?
I mean, yeah, I think we cannot put it better than this. I mean, this is the quote from the biologist E.O. Wilson. And just if you take a look at this sentence, the stories we tell ourselves and others are our survival manuals. So there are some key words here, but we will just talk about these words that it is used. But it's a very interesting concept presented here, that this is just something that we do to survive, or this is teaching us how to survive, actually.
Exactly. And if you think about it, schools have only existed in our world for the last few hundred years. And before that, how did children learn about what's dangerous in the forest or not dangerous, or how to think about strangers, or how the weather works? They learned it by stories from the elders. And when the elder member of the tribe would say, "Well, you got to watch out for Jeb was running away from a bear and he climbed up a tree and he got away, but his brother jumped in the river. And of course, bears can swim. He didn't know that, so the bear jumped in and ate him." Well, children that learn these stories and pick up these important rules about life were the ones that survived. So we evolved to be able to process information from stories to add to our repertoire. So our brains need to grow. We need to grow. And stories help us do that by being survival manuals that we pass on back and forth.
So here, something interesting is actually happening, or that was something very amazing that was discovered. So stories in nature, or by default, are just experiences, but they are the experiences that we live by. So there was this experiment by Yuri Hassan from Princeton. They just analyzed the brain of a person who was telling a story, but as the person was telling the story, that person was reliving that experience. So different parts of the brain lit up. The memory part the emotion part. I mean, that person was experiencing the same emotions or things that happened at the same time that the first experience it. But the amazing thing is the listener to this story was actually having the same reaction to the story. So they analyzed the listener's brain, and the same area of the brain lit up. So somehow their brains linked through the stories. And this is a unique characteristic that no other forms of information transfer has. This is something that is only about stories that can connect brains. So actually you can relive the experience of someone else on top of living your own experiences based on your memory. That was a very amazing finding.
Yeah, it's like human beings have this ability to download information about their life into somebody else's brain through a story.
Exactly.
It's a sort of brain linking that goes on. And interestingly, some of the people that were guessing why stories are so powerful were saying exactly this kind of thing. It's related to life events and that we can connect. So you guys are way ahead of the curve here. But again, manuals for life. So here, this story was kind of a manual for her about how to deal with the trauma of losing her individuality. But when I think of manuals, I think of things like this: push the red button, set the output trays so that the papers will fall on the tray. Something that's very technical and very clear. I don't think of something like a bear story for that. So that brings us to another aspect of how the brain works. Our brains work by metaphor. Mohammed, do you recognize who this is?
Yeah, I mean, this is the famous linguist George Lakoff.
Exactly.
The book that he published with Johnson, I guess. I don't remember the name, but the name of the book was Metaphors We Live By. That is, again, something about the story, one of the characteristics of the story that is important in this presentation.
Yeah. And metaphor is the fundamental mechanism of the mind that allows us to understand complex things. You think about it. So then we have a word like couch potato. And suddenly we can get this image like this in our head that lets us understand what, the kind of person that's laying on the couch watching TV all day, and how it's a metaphor for that. In fact, all abstract thoughts in our brains are made from metaphors of real life experiences. And of course, there's many metaphors used, like sly like a fox, or Britain is like the lion of Britain, or justice is like a scales. And all abstract thoughts come from other real life experiences. We know this because we can see different parts of the brain lighting up when people hear an abstract word that might represent more real, concrete experiences. And this is part of something called embodied simulation. We could do a whole talk on this. It's a great area. But again, all abstract concepts are based on memories of real world experiences located in our sensory cortices. So our brains work by metaphor. And the stories that you hear are metaphors for how to live. They're life manuals and they're metaphorical. So you can take the story and adapt it in so many different ways to your own real life situation. And here it is. In this case, this was a metaphor for her to get her through that problem.
So yes, so far, again, going back to this fundamental question in this presentation, that why stories are so brain compatible. So far, we talked about the fact that the stories are pleasurable and our brains love that kind of dopamine. And then we talked about the narrative structure of the stories. And of course, now we just talked about the function of metaphors helping us understanding complex abstract ideas. So yeah, let's hear from Hava.
Okay, thank you. Again, I'll try to summarize this very briefly in Turkish. Curtis Kelly, Japonya'daki bir lise öğrencisinin aslında oluşturmuş olduğu bir hikayeyi paylaştı bizimle. Burada renkli ayıların olduğunu görmüştük. Lise 1 öğrencisiydi yanlış hatırlamıyorsam ve bu öğrenci aslında kendi gerçek dünyasındaki öğrenen özelliğinin kısıtlı olmasından kaynaklı olarak kendine bir kaçma alanı yaratmıştı bu hikayeyi yazarak. İşte oradaki o sıkı uygulamalar, üniformaların olması, hepsinin birbirine çok benzer şekilde okulda olmaları aslında bu anlamda Türk eğitim sistemini de belki sorgulayabiliriz. Yani aslında bu sadece bir hikayeydi, ders için hazırlanmış bir hikayeydi ama arka planında öğrencinin aslında bu psikolojik durumuyla nasıl baş ettiğini görmüş olduk biz birlikte. Bu anlamda hikayelerin aslında bizim için hayatta kalma kılavuzları olduğunu da söyleyebiliriz dedi Curtis Kelly. Fakat aslında tam olarak da hayatta kalma kılavuzu da diyemeyiz. Çünkü bir çıktı makinesinin işte kırmızı tuşuna bas gibi bir kullanma kılavuzunda olduğu kadar her şey kesin ve açık bir şekilde bize sunulmuyor hikayelerde dedi. Yine E.O. Wilson'ın bir sözüne yer verdiler ve bu aslında çok kıymetli. Kendimize anlatmış olduğumuz hikayelerin aslında bizim kendimize ve diğerlerine anlatmış olduğumuz hikayelerin aslında bizim hayatta kalma kılavuzlarımız olduğundan bahsetti. Yine buradan beyne bağladığımızda beynimizin büyümek istediği, aslında yine konuşmacı ve dinleyici arasında bir bağ kurulması ihtiyacı. Bunun dışında eğretilemelerin, metaforların aslında beynimiz için ne kadar önemli olduğu, daha önceki deneyimlerimizin yeni deneyimleri edinirken nasıl bir rol oynadığı gibi bilgileri bizimle paylaştılar. Burada bizim hepimizin de çok iyi bildiği George Lakoff'un aslında Türkçe'de yaşadığımız metaforlar olarak çevrilmiş olan Johnson'la birlikte yazmış olduğu eserinden bahsettiler. Bu bağlamda aslında metafor dediğimiz olgu bizim kompleks olan, daha karmaşık olan konuları nasıl algıladığımızı çok iyi açıklıyor. İşte İngilizce'deki çok meşhur couch potato sözünün aslında bizim beynimizdeki yansımasıyla ilgili esprili bir görsel paylaşımları da oldu. Yani bu eğretilemelerle, biz bu metaforlarla aslında daha karmaşık olan yapıları anlayabiliyoruz. Basitten daha karmaşığa gidebiliyoruz. Daha önce hiç deneyimlemediğimiz ve soyut olan bir takım kavramları algılayabiliyoruz. İşte adalet gibi, zalimlik gibi ya da örnek vermek gerekirse sorumluluk gibi. Bunun dışında aslında çok farkında da değiliz. Bunların bir kısmı bilinçaltımızda gerçekleşiyor. Bir kısmının da aslında bilinçli bir şekilde gerçekleştiğini de söyleyebiliriz. Thank you, Curtis. I don't want to take too much time.
Okay.
Let's go back to this fundamental question, Curtis. I think you have something more to add to the list.
Oh, yeah. The question you've been asking about the whole time, why does narrative structure fit our brains? And if you think about it, narrative structure works like this. Something happens, and then something else happens, and something else happens. There's a climax, then something else happens. One thing causes another. It's all cause and effect. You know, he says this and she does that. She does that and he says this. You know, so everything is cause and effect, and our brains work by cause and effect. In fact, our brains operate by prediction. Prediction is cause and effect. Our brains are really prediction machines. For example, look at this video. You've never seen this truck. You've never seen this road. But watch how you react to this video just in a couple seconds. Ooh. Oh, do you feel your neck kind of going like that, even though it's just a video? And of course, that driver did too. He could predict that tire is going to hit his car and destroy it, so he was able to weave out of the way right away. Our brains are always predicting what's going to be happening in the next few seconds, in the next few minutes, and even in the next few hours. So this fits the way our brains work. And yeah.
I mean, this process, as you mentioned, Curtis, is called predictive processing. And in fact, we did one of the issues of the magazine on this whole process. So if you're interested, you can go to the archive and take a look at this new, interesting idea.
Yeah, predictive processing is a new theory about the brain, that we aren't really processing sensory information, we're predicting it. And it's truly fascinating and explains a lot of things about language teaching, like why our brains developed grammar. So give it a shot.
Okay. Yani burada aslında yine hikayelerin beynimize neden bu kadar uyumlu olduğu sorusunun cevabını ararken özlerinde belki anlatısal metinlerdeki anlatı arkından ya da anlatı eğrisinden bahsetmemiz söz konusu olabilir. İşte sergi dediğimiz açılış, sonra yükselen eylem, sonra doruk, sonra düşen eylem ve sonra denüman, yani aslında çözüm. İşte beynimiz aslında bunu seviyor. Yine özelinde bakıldığında bu sebep-sonuç ilişkisi beynimizin yapısına çok uygun bir şey. Çünkü aslında beynimiz de bunu yapmaya kurgulanmış diyebiliriz belki. Öngörü, paylaşmış olduğu videoda da işte hepimizin böyle bir tepki vermesi aslında tamamıyla beynimizin bir tahmin makinesi gibi algılanabileceğine dair ya da bir simülasyon belki de makinesi olarak algılanabileceğine dair açıklamalar olabilir. Özelinde tekrar burada sebep-sonuç ilişkisinin aslında çözülmesine yönelik bir algılama üzerine programlandığımızdan belki de bahsedebiliriz. Thank you, Curtis.
All right. So we've reached the 60 minutes mark. We got a little bit more to go. Is this okay if we keep speaking a little bit into the question and answer time?
I guess so, because this session included the translation periods as well. So I guess we can exit the time a little bit.
Okay. Well, we're just going to summarize up here at the end. And Mohammad, could you tell us what we've learned from stories about how they fit the brain?
I mean, the first thing that we established is the brains love stories because of this connection that we have in terms of emotion, and emotion helps us learn something in a deeper level. Then we talked about stories being as life manuals and how we can just transfer the necessary information or something that you need to survive. Then we talked about the significant component of the stories that helps us understand complicated abstract ideas or complicated ideas as metaphors. And then we talked about this narrative structure of the stories and why our brains love them, because our brain is essentially a predictive machine. And stories are mainly based on this cause and effect sequence of events. So matches our brain mechanism, actually. That's one of the reasons that we love stories, and we can learn better through stories.
Exactly. Cause and effect is the language of our brain. It's always doing cause and effect. Well, I showed you a couple of digitales, and Rex's idea was really getting big. He was setting up these digital storytelling seminars where high school students would bring digitales. And the last one we had a 1,200 entries of students making their own digitales. And they're so cute and charming. And it was so much better than a speech contest. You know, speech contests, I tend to get tired listening to people speaking kind of difficult English I can't really quite understand, but that never felt that way at the digitales festivals. So Osaka Gakuen even built a studio around Rex to help him develop this idea. And I thought it was going to be the next best thing. But then something happened. One day, Rex and I were going to go to a school nearby, a high school, and do a digitales seminar for the students. Well, Rex called me up that morning and said, Curtis, I don't feel too good. I think I got the flu or something. Can you do it by yourself? I said, sure, no problem. And I went to the school, and it's just a very easy way to teach how to do digitales. And teaching him how to use PowerPoint. Came back, called him up a couple days later and said, Rex, I did it by myself. There was no problem at all. How you doing? And Rex said it wasn't the flu that he had. He had lung cancer, stage 4. Even though he was really fit, he never smoked. Somehow he got lung cancer. Well, I went to visit him in the hospital. We took pictures like this of him holding beer and cigarettes. And we told the faculty he's really just taking a vacation and stuff. Of course, that was all just a joke, but Rex died. It didn't matter. He had no chance to live. And without Rex, you know, the man that taught me about stories, I lost all interest in doing digitales. So for 10 years, we just stopped doing it. But then just a couple years ago, one of the teachers that we'd done this program for in the past called me back and said, would you please teach digitales to my students again? And here we are. They're all making their own digitales. And one of those was the colorful bears. And then something amazing happened. It happened with this girl. Her name was Saki Neo. And the teacher, before the class started, said, well, Saki, her English is pretty low. In fact, she's the worst student in the class. You might have to give her a little bit of help. But that day, she made a really simple digitail, and it was by far the most popular in the class. And I'm going to show it to you right now. A little Superman. That's it. And she was so popular that day, Saki Neo, the worst student in the class, but her digitail was a big hit. And look at her face. I took this at the end of the class. Look at her face. Look at that happy girl. You know, usually it's the ones that have come back from abroad that speak English really well that get all the applause from her fellow students. But she found another way to do it, through a digitail, where English is not the target, but it's the conduit to be creative and to touch other people's lives. And that's the great thing that I got from Rex, that we got from Rex. A better way to teach. A way to teach is full of aloha, you know? And so I think even now, I've lost family over the years, but I think it's Rex I miss the most. And I can't do a presentation on storytelling without bringing him in. So that's the end of our presentation. But Mohammad, do you have a word again about our magazine?
I mean, yes, thank you very much, Curtis. But the point is, again, if you are interested to learn more about these kind of areas of the analysis that is going on about what happens in our brain when we are reading the stories, or in other areas that as teachers we can use in the classroom, just subscribe and read about this stuff in the magazine. We have different issues on different topics, and all of the issues are available for free in the archive. So just go ahead and check it out.
We have one on storytelling, don't we?
Yep.
Uh-huh. Well, that's the end of the presentation. Again, please subscribe to our magazine. Please feel free to write for us too. And Hava, do you have some comments for us?
Yes, I think very briefly I should summarize the last part.
Okay.
Sevgili izleyicilerimiz, bu arada bu dergilere üyelikle ilgili paylaşımlarımız chatten yapılıyor olacak. Birazdan erişebileceğinizi düşünüyoruz. Oradan takip edebilirsiniz. Bu arada güzel sorular var. Hamza Havuz beyefendinin soruları var. Onları da birazdan Curtis beyefendiye iletiyor olacağız. Son kısımda neler ifade edildiğini açıklayacak olursak, aslında biraz üzücü bir paylaşımda bulundu Curtis Kelly bizimle. Yaklaşık bir 10 yıl öncesine dayanıyor zannediyorum bu projelerin başlatılması. Daha önceden Rex isminden bahsetmiştik. Hawaii'den bir hocaydı kendisi. Bu dijital hikaye anlatılması ve öğrencilere bu şekilde PowerPoint yansılar hazırlatılmasına dair çalışmaların aslında fikir babası. Ne yazık ki kendisini kaybetmişiz. Kanser nedeniyle, 4. evrede tespit edilmiş olan bir kanser nedeniyle vefat etmiş kendisi. O yüzden Curtis Kelly ne zaman storytelling, yani hikaye anlatılması ve anlatısal metinlerle ilgili bir sunum söz konusu olsa mutlaka Rex'ten bahsettiği bilgisini verdi bize. Ve evet, aslında Muhammed'in de özetlediği şekilde hikayelerde duygu var. Beynimizin çok sevdiği bir şey. Bizim için bunlar hayatta kalma kılavuzları demiştik. Ve metafor en önemlisi. Zaten aslında o anlatısal metinlerdeki eğriden tekrar bahsettiğimizde beynimizin dili aslında sebep-sonuç ilişkilerini algılamak ve örüntüleri yakalamak diyebiliriz belki. Öngörülerde bulunmak diyebiliriz belki. Bununla bağlantılı yine Curtis bizimle örnek bir, aslında İngilizce seviyesinin çok da iyi olmadığı bir öğrencisinin örnek hazırlanmış bir hikayesini paylaştı. Ve orada da yine öğrencinin kendisine yarattığı alanın ve dil kullanımındaki yaratıcılığının etkilerini görmüş olduk. Tekrar sunumun en başına belki bağlayacak olursak yine bu noktada girdi merkezli bir dil öğretimi sürecinden ziyade aslında output dediğimiz çocukların ürettiği, dili kullandıkları ve dille ortaya bir yaratıcılıkta bulunarak ürün çıkartabildikleri öğretim süreçlerinden bahsedebiliriz belki. I guess I could summarize the whole thing. I tried to do my best.
Wonderful job. Thank you very much.
I thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Let me add one thing here too, that digitales is kind of a hard technique to use if you don't have computers, but just telling stories in class, and never mind the pre-vocabulary work or the comprehension questions, just tell stories and then just summarize them like Hava did back in the native language. And if anybody writes me, I'd be glad to give you a package of stories that are written down that you can use in class. I have some PDFs like this of some great stories. And also, I've started using YouTube at the end of my class, especially online classes. There are great stories on YouTube, really touching stories. Again, if you write me, I'd be glad to send you the link, my Dropbox link, where you can download great music and great stories from YouTube. Okay. So shall we do some question answer, Hava?
Yes, I guess so, Curtis. It's high time, but can we share your email address with the audience? Is it okay with you?
Okay. Let's see. Can I put it in the chat, or what? How can I do that?
I guess you had better try this private chat here. Can you see that down there?
It's
I would do that.
ctskelly@gmail.com. CTS for Curtis. CTS Kelly. CTSKELLY. Yeah, that's a pretty easy one. Curtis Kelly, easy to remember.
Thank you. This was really a very fruitful presentation, and it was inspiring as well. Thank you for providing these creative ideas. And it's quite simple. I guess we can use it in Turkish language classes as well, students using their computers and creating those digitales. Evet, yani aslında sunmuş oldukları öneri bu 10 yıl öncesine dayanıyor demiştim. Rex Beyefendi'nin vefatından sonra tekrar daha önce çalışma yaptıkları okuldan bir öğretmenin aramasıyla bu projelere başlıyorlar. Belki ülkemizde de bu tür projeleri başlatabiliriz. Öğrencilerimizin gerek Türkçe öğrendiği sınıflarda, gerek İngilizce öğrendiği sınıflarda hazır bu anlatısal metinlerin yapısının beynimizin aslında sinir bilimsel anlamdaki yapısına ve fizyolojik yapısına uygunluğunu da öğrenmişken. Şimdi çok önemli sorularımız vardı. Öncelikle Hamza Havuz hocamızdan geldi. Hocam elimden geldiğince çevirmeye çalışacağım. Biraz simultane olacağı için umarım sormak istediğiniz soruyu soruyor olabiliriz. First of all, Curtis, Hamza Havuz, yes, I guess that's the name, yes. Hamza Havuz hocamız der ki, by using these stories, maybe we can store those learning processes, and maybe in this way, this process can provide us this creativity process, which is required to process the information. And maybe at the fundamental level, this is about the power of our brain, because the most important thing here is like the relationships, our brain is trying to get the connection between those relationships. Is this the reason? Actually, that was what he was trying to ask. I don't know.
That's a great comment. Yeah. Oh, that's a great comment. And in fact, it's the relationships between things that's part of embodied simulation, that our brain has everything connected to it, and the stories sort of reinforce those connections between emotions and visual and auditory and motor sensory nerve firings that are all connected to each other. I'm having a hard time explaining that. I think your comment was, that person's comment was right on target.
Evet
Mohammad,
hocam.
I mean, the only thing that I can add here is about the nature. I mean, today we just talked about, I mean, I just want to talk about how amazing this whole area is. Today we just talked about why our brain loves the stories. We didn't even talk about what happens if we try to write the stories, about the creativity level and the different parts of the brain that will be activated when you are actually writing or creating the story, and how we can use that in the classes. That's the whole another subject. But just think about the potential that we are talking about here about stories. These are just a mechanism that our brain uses to understand or enjoy the stories, but there's a whole different level of game when we are just creating the stories. That's something to think on.
I just noticed too that Khosrow, I'm not sure how to say that exactly correctly, but Khosrow wrote, can we use stories that aren't related to the point being taught in the class? And yes, I do. I don't care about, we organize our classes into, like grammar topics and things like that because I'm not sure why, because that's not how we learn language. We don't organize things always that carefully. But I think stories are their own like little packages. And when I tell stories, it's usually at the end of class when everybody's going home. I'll take a touching story, not an old fable, because those had different kind of moral messages, but something from a book like Chicken Soup for the Soul, some kind of touching story about modern life. And I tell that at the end of class. My students always leave with a really good feeling. And no matter how boring my class was for the first 85 minutes, if I tell a good story in the last 5, they forgive me for it.
Peki, Curtis, here I'd like to translate some parts. I guess you've mentioned and you've touched upon very important issues. Hamza Hocam, elimden geldiğince çevirmeye çalıştım. Evet, sonsuz katılmaktalar görüşlerinize ve aslında yine burada hikayelerin ne kadar önemli olduğu konusuna yine Muhammed Bey'in de ifade ettiği gibi sadece maruz kalma, yani okuma bağlamında ele aldık. Bir de yazma ve yaratıcılık bağlamında ele alsak çok daha büyük etkilerden bahsediyor olabiliriz. Çok daha ilginç veriler ortaya çıkabilir gibi paylaşımları oldu. Sonrasında Khosrow Vahabi hanımefendinin sorusu aslında bu kullandığımız hikayelerin birebir öğrettiğimiz konular ya da içeriklerle bağlantılı olması gerekmekte mi gibi bir sorusu oldu. Hayır diyor Curtis. Yani aslında belki de bu uzun anlatımlardan sonra öğrencinin rahatlaması için böyle küçük, onların da eğlenebileceği, keyif alabileceği paylaşımlarda bulunabiliriz dedi. O kısmı çevirip çevirmediğimizden çok emin değilim ama Curtis Kelly'nin bu anlamda e-mail adresini de aslında bununla ilgili olarak paylaşmıştı. Kendisinin bir paketi var, oluşturmuş olduğu, uyarlamış olduğu bir takım hikayeler var. Kendisi bunları paylaşmaktan da çok büyük keyif alacağını ifade etmişti. There are some people thanking, yes. Elimden geldiğince hocam çevirileri yapmaya çalışıyorum, Doğan hocam. There was another question actually. I tried to note down that one, but I missed the one about afazia. Afazi ile ilgili olan sorunuzu hatırlayabildiğim kadarıyla çevirmeye çalışayım Hamza hocam, ama öncelikle bir önceki sorunuzu ben not edebilmiştim o süreçte, onu sorabilirim. So the next question again by Hamza Havuz Curtis was that, and Mohammad. Sinir biliminde dil üzerinde mevcut sınırları aşabileceği bir öngörü mevcut mu? Dil kodlamasının yapay şekilde yapılabilmesi gibi. So this is a more technical question, to be honest. Is it possible, when we consider this neurolinguistics, from the perspective of language teaching and language learning, can it exceed its limits? Can we make such a prediction? Or is it possible, language coding to be realized or to be attained in an artificial way? Is this possible? Could you understand my question?
I don't quite understand the question.
Let me try.
Coding be done in an artificial
I mean, if
way?
I understand it correctly, I guess the question is about this prediction mechanism that we have. So the question is, how far can this prediction go, actually? So
No,
will we reach a point?
sorry, excuse me, Mohammad, but like the final part was something like this. This language coding, can we realize this in an artificial way? Can we manage creating that language coding in an artificial way?
What would the artificial way be? I'm not quite sure.
Maybe, creating this in a laboratory context or something. I'm not sure. Okay.
I don't think I can answer that question.
I see. Mohammad, you were saying something. I interrupted, sir, about that.
No, but that was my understanding of the question, I guess. This is something that, again, we can think about. Because we talked about this prediction mechanism, and the question, a natural question that comes with this concept is how far this prediction can go actually in terms of languages. So, or how far can we manipulate this process in terms of producing it artificially or playing with this mechanism or something, which is a very technical question. So I was just trying to understand the question, if I'm not mistaken.
Yani aslında thank you Muhammed. Yani aslında bu predictive processing denilen çok yeni bir anlayış. Benim de biraz araştırdığım kadarıyla hani çok derin bir okuma henüz gerçekleştiremedim ama öngörüsel işleme gibi bizim alan yazılımımızda ulaştım birkaç metinde bu ifadeye. Predictive processing belki tekrar ifade edebiliriz araştırma yapmak isteyen izleyicilerimiz için. Yani evet, aslında bu alanda henüz keşfedilmemiş çok fazla şey var, söylenecek çok fazla şey var. Curtis'in ve Muhammed'in de ifade ettiği gibi biraz teknik bir alan, belki şu anda çok hızlıca cevaplayamayacağımız ama evet, bu alanda yapılacak çok fazla çalışma ve henüz ulaşılamamış çok fazla bilgi mevcut diyebiliriz belki.
I think I can add something here. Basically, our brain is organized into experiences, and those experiences represent mental models that we make about how the world works. Like if I hit somebody, they might hit me back. We have these mental models that we activate when we see a particular situation, like if somebody's looking at us with wide eyes and foam coming out of their mouth, then our mental model says this person's about ready to hit us. And these models can become quite complex, and we're applying these models to the world all the time. And we build these models through experiences or through shared experience, other people's stories, including movies. I've never met a piranha fish, but I've seen enough movies where piranha are eating people if they jump in a river that I'm going to be really careful if I ever go to the Amazon and there's a river nearby and I need a bath or something. So we have these mental models that we're building all the time that we're emplacing onto the world to figure out what's going to be happening next. So I think your question was kind of related to that in a way.
I see. Okay. Thank you, Curtis. Very quickly, I'll try to translate that. Yani aslında beynimizin bu şimdiye kadar yaşamış olduğumuz deneyimleri ya da belki de hikayelerden, anlatısal metinlerden, filmlerden edinmiş olduğumuz deneyimlerin içeride nasıl organize edildiğine dair zihinsel temsillerden bahsediyoruz tabii ki burada. Yani işte bir piranayı gerçek hayatta gerçekten görmüş olmayabiliriz ama biliyoruz ki biz aslında filmlerden pirana dediğimiz balık oldukça tehlikeli bir balık. Yani bu şekilde geçmiş deneyimlerimizin bizi yeni bilgilere erişme aşamasında yönlendirdiğini söyleyebiliriz belki. Bu zihinsel temsiller, geçmişten elde etmiş olduğumuz deneyimler ve aslında işte bu noktada tam da hikayeler devreye girmiş oluyor. Belki çocuklara çok fazla hikaye anlatmamızın bir sebebi de bu. So I'm adding some personal comments, Curtis, with your permission.
Sure, yes, please do.
Yani çocuklar da mesela hep bir çirkin olur, bir güzel olur, bir kötü olur, değil mi? Bunları çocuklar deneyimlemeden hikayelerden öğrensin isteriz. Aslında aynı şey dil sınıflarımızda da geçer diyebiliriz. So I was just saying that, even with our own kids, we just tell them stories because we don't want them to experience those bad events in real life. So, by reading or by hearing those stories, they can build their experiences without being, exposed to them in real life. And that's something protective. That's something protective. They learn about.
You hit something that's really close to me. When I had two daughters, I decided, do I want to build smart girls No, I think my primary goal is to build girls with warm hearts. So I made it my duty every night before they went to sleep to make up some kind of a story about, dealing with strangers or helping friends or human relations. And every night, I have 1,000 or so of these recorded. I'd come up with some kind of a story to tell them at bedtime. And I never knew if this was working or not until one day something happened. My wife was upstairs and she came downstairs in the house screaming, Kelly, Kelly, please come help us. There's a bug upstairs. And she hates any kind of a bug. And behind her was my 4-year-old daughter, Alice, running down the stairs. And I said, okay, I'll get it. So I got out of bed, I was reading a book. I got out of bed, took a tissue, started to walk up the stairs, and Alice started to cry. I said, don't worry, Alice, I'll get it. And she said, no, Daddy, you're carrying a tissue. That means you're going to kill it. But that bug has a mommy and a daddy too. And then I knew the stories were working. So I said, okay, Alice, I won't kill it, I promise. Come with me. We went up, we got the bug, we got it to walk onto the tissue, opened the window, blew it outside. And that's where another way I knew the real power of stories.
Great, thank you, Curtis. Yes, that's actually the message that we're trying to give here. Curtis Kelly yine aslında kendi çocuklarının eğitiminde de hikayelerin ne kadar önemli olduğundan bahsetmiş oldu. Küçük bir anekdot paylaştı bununla ilgili. Eşinin böceklerden hiç hoşlanmadığını ama 4 yaşındaki küçük kızı Alice'in de onların da anne babası olacağını ve kesinlikle böceği öldürmemeleri gerektiğine dair paylaşımını aktarmış oldu bize. Teşekkür ederiz. Yes, any other questions? So people, they say thank you. I mean,
I have a question for them. Did you notice that my presentation was fairly easy to follow, but my presentation was actually built of stories. And there's something like 8 different stories that came out during the presentation, not just the digitales, but other things too. But if you're going to do presentations too, or any kind of a presentation, my speech trainer taught me, make 80% of it stories or anecdotes or experiences like that, and only 20% explaining.
Should I translate this? This is very important, Curtis.
Sure.
Yani aslında ben de fark etmedim ama 8 you said, right? 8 different stories within this presentation.
About 8 different stories in the presentation.
I haven't realized that. I mean, evet 8 farklı aslında hikayenin bu sunumun içine gizlenmiş olduğu diyeyim. Bundan bahsetti ve aslında sunum yapmak üzere olan hocalar için bir hatırlatmada bulundu. Kendisine de bu konuda eğitim aldığı hocası ifade etmiş anladığım kadarıyla. Yapmış olduğumuz bu konuşmaların aslında %80'inin bu tür hikayelerden oluşması ve belki açıklama kısmının, bu bilimsel daha kuramsal olan kısmının %20 civarında olması gerektiğine dair bir paylaşımda bulundu. We'll definitely keep this in mind, Curtis, the next time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Evet.
Wow,
Başka sorumuz var mıdır? Link paylaşımlarımız olacak demiştik. Olmadı zannediyorum henüz, değil mi? Şöyle tekrar kontrol ettiğimde. Evet. Do you have any other questions? Okay, I'm just waiting for a couple of minutes, just to make sure that we don't have any other questions from the audience.
Okay, well, I want to say thank you to everybody. Your How Do Stories Work? You had some great, you were already ahead of the curve. There was some of the answers were already coming out before we even got to that part of our presentation. And Mohammad, it was fun to present with you the first time. We had joint presentation together.
It was an honor just to be in conversation with you about something that we both love, and we know that we love it. So thank you very much.
Yeah. I really like Mohammad. I've only known him for 6 months, but already I feel like he's my brother. In Istanbul.
The feeling is mutual, Curtis. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. By the way, I think we couldn't share your email address and the links due to a technical problem, I guess. But very briefly, maybe, and very quickly, I can remind your email address at least to our audience. ctskeli@gmail.com'dan kendisine ulaşabilirsiniz bu konuda. Özellikle hikayeler konusunda gerek kendi yazmış olduğu, uyarlamış olduğu hikayelerin paylaşılması, gerekse burada bahsetmiş olduğumuz ve hiçbir üyelik ücreti gerekmeyen dergilere belki de üyelik konusunda ben takip ediyorum. Her ay farklı bir tema üzerinden gidiyorlar. Predictive Processing demiştik. Storytelling ile ilgili bir sayıdan bahsetmişlerdi ve Mohammad Khari de aslında derginin editörlüğünü yapıyor. I guess you're the editor, right, Mohammad? I'm not mistaken.
We are a team of editors, yeah.
I see, okay, but you're one of those.
Yes.
So I was just trying to remind this magazine to the audience. Okay, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and, having this great presentation. It was really inspiring, Sometimes I tend to be more analytical, and now I'll try to be more relational. I'll try to add more stories to my sessions, while I'm teaching the language. And maybe about that question, one of the ladies asked, should it be related to what we are teaching? From my personal perspective, I'm planning to use it especially for vocabulary practice part, It doesn't have to be a grammar topic all the time, but maybe we can use it with vocabulary teaching, the target vocab items being assigned to students and they're creating their own digitales. I guess that's a great idea because they create their own context, and in that way, it makes it more memorable, as you've already pointed out.
Yeah, me too. I teach business English. Now, how do you teach business English? I said, well, I'm going to use what I know, gather great stories about companies. And so I've got 12 great stories about Starbucks and some Japanese companies. And then I just highlight certain vocabulary, business English vocabulary I want them to learn. By the way, if anybody would like that book too, please send me an email. I'll be glad to send you the PDF of it. It's not published, so it's free. But yeah, we can use stories for anything.
Great. Even for business English.
Yeah.
Okay. Peki son olarak toparlayacak olursak, dil öğretim süreçlerinde hep bu konularla ilintili olmak zorunda mı gibi bir soru sorulmuştu ve hayır değil demişti aslında Curtis Kelly. Psikolojik bir rahatlama, belki öğrencilerle bir yakınlık, bir iletişim kurma. En önemlisi insan olduğumuzu hatırlama anlamında hikayelerin öneminden bahsedebilirdik. Çünkü beynimizin bunu sevdiğini anlamış olduk. Fakat ben orada bir katkı koyduğumda belki en temelinde bu bir dil bilgisi konusu olmasa dahi öğretilen kelimelerin daha akılda kalıcı olduğu. Yani 7 kata kadar da o oran hatırlarsak yapılmış olan çalışmalarda öğrencilerin kendi bağlamlarını yaratmaları, o sözcükleri kullanmaları, işte belki grup çalışmaları yapmaları gibi hikayeleri çok daha yoğun, en azından ben derslerime entegre etmeye karar vermiş oldum bu sunumdan sonra. So, once again, I would like to say thank you. We are really grateful for this effort, for this time. It was 3 a.m. in Japan, and I guess it's like 5 a.m. early in the morning.
4:35 now. I'm going to be getting up in a couple minutes. And Hava, I hope this isn't the last time we meet. I'd love to have you. We'd love to have you write something about grit or hedging and bolstering in academic writing for us.
Thank you so much.
Please keep in touch.
Hope to collaborate in the future. Sevgili izleyicilerimiz, bugünkü yayınımızın sonuna geldik. 3 dakikada süremizi aşmış olduk ama umarım keyif almışsınızdır. Çok teknik, belki de sinir bilimsel konulara girmiş olamadık ama aslında hikayeler ve dil öğretimi anlamında bize feyz verebilecek, bize ilham kaynağı oluşturabilecek bilgileri aldık Curtis'ten ve Muhammed Bey'den diye düşünüyorum. Kendilerine tekrar teşekkür ediyorum. Size de katılımınız için ve sorularınız için çok teşekkür ediyorum. İyi akşamlar dileklerimizle. Japonya'da şu an sabah olmak üzere. Kendilerine de çok teşekkür ediyoruz. İyi akşamlar.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Mohammad.